Hi everyone, this is Joseph, this is Margaret, and I just attended AILA's first session here on Wednesday. It's the anti-racist session. Being a part of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee for AILA in this past year, we learned a lot, and this session touches on 2 points that I really want to talk about. The first is the easier one. How do you advocate for your clients when government officials discriminate against you, your clients, because of your skin color, nationality, sexual orientation, gender? The second issue is a little bit more touchy. How do we build a firm that checks these discriminations internally?
I think it's important to acknowledge that it exists. So being aware of that bias that you do have, and it could possibly help you even win the case. For a marriage-based petition where the petitioner was a Hispanic woman and the beneficiary was an Asian male. Traditionally, this is not your normal couple that you would see, and we really saw USCIS question that. They gave us an RFP that was pretty extensive. It had at least 20 different things that they were questioning. Whereas on a normal petition, you might see like 3 or 4, maybe 5.
There was one interview, a second interview, a second request for evidence, a third interview, and at each one of these interviews, the officer is just extremely upset, mean, and challenging. Rolling eyes at every question that she asked. The answer is just not pleasing to her, and eventually just denied the case multiple times. Actually, right? Again, it was a very difficult case. A lot of statistics just doesn't match up. They didn't interview the best. They didn't behave like a normal couple. So we grant USCS all of that. But yet, they were still challenging things that they shouldn't challenge.
Aside from answering all of their concerns and explaining all of the different discrepancies and providing reasonable explanations, one of our attorneys who attended the interview, he actually had to pause the interview and ask for a supervisor, because that's just how unprofessional it was. Because we showed that there was a lot of overt racism and biases, we were able to show that it really wasn't a fair case.
When you expose that, then the supervisor was able to take over the case and then just approve it. I know CBP officers, youth consulate officers, as well as USCIS officers, they do get a lot of these trainings on racism and implicit bias. They are not just going in completely blindsided, but the fact that there is training shows that training is needed and people are imperfect. And if this is their first case, or if they're just jaded, angry, and upset, then there might be some other underlying issues at play. And so when a case is being adjudicated unfairly, when you're reading between the lines, you're able to expose that. It actually could help the case.
I studied criminal justice and psychology, and we learned about different stereotypes and how this information is actually useful because it helps you sort a lot of information. So, for example, with CBP officers, they're basically allowing thousands of people in a day. They kind of have to do the best in that moment. So where do you draw the fine line between what is racism or what is the officer being efficient?
Just because there's a denial doesn't mean somebody was racist. So a lot of times when clients immediately say, oh, I had an officer that was discriminatory, it might not be that. It might be, at best, an implicit bias. Just because they see you as a skin color and they pull you aside and search you or question you, that in itself does not mean they're necessarily racist. It's just because the psychology and the work that they have to do, if you fit a particular statistical background on their policy manual and they're trained to do a certain thing, they're going according to their rule book. However, when they pull you aside and then they make remarks that show that they have a prejudice against you as an individual and they're attacking your character, then that might be wrong. Or if they're not actively trying to correct their prejudice, right? It says, I have to pull you aside, I have to do a search, this is the purpose of it, let me know. And then if they go through what they have to do and they're very professional and they ask you key questions and you're able to answer appropriately, then that's okay. So it's an unfair system, it's an unfair world, but not every denial and every search and every question is necessarily racist. But what's the most dangerous is not necessarily the overt racism, because if you're overtly racist, you can get called out on it and then things can be corrected. It's the implicit bias. And of course, we've heard horror stories of CBP officers at the customs level where they are just pulling everybody who looks a particular different way. So I think our job as an attorney, as a paralegal, is to just advise the clients what their rights are and how they can better explain.
So I think one of the interesting challenges that we come across is that there are some American clients that we have that this is like the very first time that they're going through the immigration process or any sort of system of that nature, and they feel super angry or treated unfairly that they even have to respond to anything. Even when it's just the norm, it's like the basic norm, and they'll make comments like they're treating her like an immigrant in regards to their spouse. So it's just interesting because again, it's like their first case, in their opinion, treated unfairly, whereas like our other immigrants, they're used to it. They're just trying to do their best.
Right. Yeah. Advocating for clients, challenging implicit bias, challenging racism when we see it, that's almost the easy part. It's much harder to explain that when you are being questioned, that itself is not racism, right? That's just the officers doing their job. All right, now we're going to talk about the second question, which I think is the much more interesting and difficult question to answer. How do we, as a firm, make sure that there's no implicit bias in our own firm? How do we make sure that there's no over racism in our own firm? Margaret is the HR, human resource manager at the office. She does all the recruiting. A lot of the interns' applications all go through her. A lot of the first phone calls. Implicit bias, discrimination is when our existing system almost only exclusively looks to a certain demographic or person. And when we just use that particular system, then it naturally weeds out everybody else, right? And so that's an implicit discrimination against all these different people. So do you see any of that at our firm that you can see? I mean, you've been here for 5 years. You were yourself an intern 10 years ago.
Yeah, I think naturally being in the immigration law office, we're attracting people from all walks of life with different ethnic backgrounds. All of our interns are so different. I think even within our law firm staff members, we have so much diversity, and we're never explicitly looking for any race. It's not something that I have to really make sure that we have diversity. I think we're very fortunate at our firm that we already have a lot of diversity. We don't have to make like this campaign to recruit diverse candidates.
Right. I guess just in the field of immigration, it's already not very naturally diverse.
Yeah.
I think diversity is important because you just don't know what you don't know. And if everybody is the same mentality, if from the same bubble, then you just don't know all these other things. And when you have diversity, then you get to check those assumptions with each other. And so that's why it's important. Now, if you have only one position to fill, you want to fill the person who's the most excellent. Now, if everything being equal, and then everybody else at the firm is one particular demographic, the person who's diverse basically has an edge on everybody else. During the President Trump's administration, a lot of the immigration policies that were in play were Republican leaning. If you didn't know the Republican rhetoric, if you didn't know the But American First policies, that you wouldn't be able to use it appropriately in your cases. And we were able to win a few cases based on those policies. You really have to have a good paradigm and perspective to be able to understand everything. And the best way to achieve that is through diversity.